James, I gave you everything, things I can't take back. My body, my money, you gave me silence.
She whispered those words not in anger, but in the exhausted, hollow tone of a woman who had loved so completely that she had nothing left of herself to recognize in the mirror. This is the story of Chisom, a woman who poured every drop of herself into a love that was never designed to hold her. A woman who sacrificed her dignity, her family, and her future for a man who mistook her loyalty for weakness and her love for convenience. What he did next didn't just break her heart, it broke her entirely. Please sit back, relax, as we dive fully into this really remarkable story. Abia State. A city that never sleeps, never slows down, always moving traders, generators humming in the distance, the smell of suya smoke threading through narrow streets at dusk. It was here that Chisom Akafor grew up. She was the kind of girl people noticed not because she was loud, but because she was present. Warm. Real. She had the sort of face that made strangers feel at ease, wide dark eyes that always seemed to be listening, a slow and careful smile that she didn't give out carelessly. Her mother sold fabric at the main market. Her father repaired motorcycles on the roadside. They were not wealthy, but their home was clean, their love was visible, and Chisom grew up understanding that dignity was not something money gave you. It was something you built quietly, day by day, with your choices. She was the second of 4 children. She cooked before school. She helped with her younger siblings on weekends. She didn't complain about the things she didn't have. She dreamed, yes, she dreamed richly and without apology, but she kept her feet flat on the ground. At 16, she met James. James was not what most girls would have pointed to and called a future. He drove a Keek Napip, a commercial tricycle, along the dusty routes of Abia. He lived in a face-me-I-face-you compound where 10 families shared 2 bathrooms, and the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbor's arguments word for word. He wore the same 3 shirts in rotation. He owned nothing of significance, but James had something that money couldn't manufacture. Fire. He talked about the future the way some men pray, with absolute, unshakable belief. He would sit with Chisom under the mango tree behind her family's compound, his arms animated, his voice low and urgent, painting pictures of a life neither of them had ever touched. Chisom, I'm not going to be here forever. This Keek is just the beginning. I'm going to have businesses, real ones. I'm going to travel. We're going to travel. I just need time. And she believed him, not blindly, not naively. She believed him the way you believe in rain during Harmattan, not because the sky looks ready, but because you know it always comes eventually. She saw something in him that she was willing to water. She was willing to wait. They started dating when she was 16 and he was 18. And for the first 2 years, it was the kind of love that songs try to explain and never quite reach. He came to her house every Sunday. He remembered small things, the way she liked her pepper soup, the name of her late grandmother, the particular shade of fabric her mother always wore to church. He held her hand in public without embarrassment. He said I love you like he meant to keep it. She gave him her whole heart, not a piece of it, not a carefully measured portion, all of it. By the time Chisom was 19, she had already begun paying for that love in ways she told no one. The first payment was the one that cost her the most, the one she carried in her body and then had to release before anyone could see. She was 3 months along when she found out. She sat on the edge of her bed and pressed both hands against her stomach and felt something enormous and terrifying and quietly sacred. And then James sat beside her and said, carefully, reasonably, in the voice he used when he had already made up his mind, Chisom, we can't do this. Not now. You know that, right? She did not argue. She did not cry in front of him. She cried alone in the bathroom with the tap running so no one would hear. And then she did what he asked. She told herself it was practical. She told herself it was love, the kind of love that makes sacrifices, that understands the bigger picture. She carried that silence forward and packed it somewhere deep, behind her ribs where she thought it couldn't reach her. She was wrong, but she wouldn't know that yet. The second payment came the following year, when James fell terribly ill. A fever that wouldn't break. A weakness so complete he could barely sit upright. His family was not equipped. No savings, no connections, barely enough for food. The hospital required money up front, and the amount felt impossible against everything Chisom had. She spent her savings first. All of it the small, careful pile she had been building for 2 years from occasional tailoring work and helping at her mother's stall. Then she borrowed from a friend who trusted her, from a distant cousin who asked no questions. She paid it back later, slowly, quietly, without ever being asked, but even that was not enough. And so Chisom did the thing she would never speak of, the thing that lived in her chest like a stone that couldn't be moved. At night, when the city was dark and the streets were different, she went out. She did what the situation demanded. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself no one would ever know. She told herself that love sometimes asked the unbearable of you, and that enduring the unbearable was itself a kind of strength. She came home before dawn. She washed herself carefully. She lay down beside James and listened to him breathe, steadier now, stronger because of her, and she pressed her eyes shut and told herself, it will be worth it. It has to be worth it. The storm had already begun, and it was completely silent. It arrived the way most life-changing things do. Not with fanfare, not with warning, but quietly, dressed in the ordinary clothing of a casual conversation. James came to her one evening in the way he always did when he wanted something, sitting close, voice low, eyes bright with that particular light she had learned to love, and though she didn't know it yet, should have learned to fear. He smelled of the road. His shirt was dusty at the collar, but his hands, when he reached for hers, were steady. Chisom. I have news. She looked up from the blouse she was mending, a neighbor's, one of the small tailoring jobs she had been quietly building to replace what she had spent on him. She searched his face and found something there she hadn't seen in months. Hope. Real hope. The kind that made the air between them feel charged, like the sky just before a downpour. He had met someone. A connection. A man from their area who had traveled to Germany years ago and built something substantial for himself. This man was not offering charity. He was offering a pathway. A visa process, documentation, a contact on the other end who could help with accommodation and early employment. The opportunity was real. The window was narrow. James needed money. Chisom was quiet for a long time after he finished talking. Outside, a neighbor's radio played something slow and familiar. A generator rumbled to life 2 compounds away. She watched the small flame of the candle between them bend sideways in a draft, then right itself. Much, she asked. He told her. She didn't flinch. Not outwardly. But inside something shifted, a deep, tectonic movement she wouldn't be able to name until much later. It was not reluctance. It was not fear. It was the sound of a door closing somewhere far inside her, very softly, on something she could not yet identify. She said yes. Of course she said yes. Because James looked at her in that moment the way he used to look at her under the mango tree, like she was the only real thing in a world full of noise. And he made her a promise. He held both her hands and he looked directly into her eyes and he said the words slowly, like he was signing his name to something legal and permanent. Chisom. The moment I get there and find my feet, 6 months, 1 year at the most, I'm coming back for you. We will do the wedding. Proper. I swear it on everything. She believed him. God help her, she believed him. What followed was a dismantling, not a dramatic one. Not the kind that happens in a single afternoon. It was slow and methodical, the way water erodes stone, unremarkable in any single moment, devastating in accumulation. She started with her savings. Whatever remained after his hospital bills, after the loans, after the months of quietly bleeding herself dry to keep him upright, she counted it all out and gave it to him with both hands, the way you give an offering at an altar. It was not enough. She borrowed next. She went to her friend Adiz first, a girl she had known since primary school, someone who trusted her completely and asked nothing but a repayment timeline. Chisom gave her one she wasn't sure she could keep. Then she went to a woman in the next street who ran a quiet money-lending arrangement, the kind that didn't require paperwork but required your reputation as collateral. The interest was uncomfortable. She agreed anyway. Still, it was not enough. And so she did the thing that would cost her everything else. Her father kept a small metal box beneath the floorboard of his bedroom, a place Chisom had known about since she was a child, a place her father believed was his most private secret. Inside it was money he had saved over years, not a fortune by any standard, but it was his. It was everything he had built slowly, with cracked hands and early mornings and a life spent bending over other people's motorcycles. It was for emergencies. It was for the future. She took from it one night while he slept. She stood in the dark of his room and listened to him breathe and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not guilt exactly, but something older and heavier than guilt. Something that felt like grief. She told herself she would replace it. She told herself he would never need to know. She told herself that once James made it and came back for her, everything would be restored, and she would tell the whole story and her father would laugh and shake his head and call her stubborn and love her all the more for it. She took the money and she closed the box, and she left the room. 3 days later, her mother discovered that her business funds were also gone. A portion she had been saving to expand her fabric stall, 2 years of careful, quiet accumulation. Chisom had taken that too, in a moment of desperation when the numbers still didn't add up. The house erupted. Her mother wept in a way Chisom had never seen before, not loudly, but with a terrible stillness, tears running down her face while her hands lay open and empty in her lap, like a woman who had been robbed of something she didn't have the language to name. Her father did not weep. He looked at her for a long time, and then he said with a quiet that was worse than shouting, "You are no longer my daughter." He meant it. He turned his back and he walked into his room and he closed the door, and for weeks, when she was still in that house, he moved around her like she was furniture, like she was air, like she was already gone. Her siblings didn't understand. Her neighbors whispered. The street knew, the way streets always know, not the full truth, but enough of a shape that people could fill in the rest with their imaginations. Chisom packed a small bag and moved in with a distant cousin 3 streets away. She sent James every naira she had gathered. She told him what it had cost. He received the money and he thanked her. He said he would never forget this. He said she was the strongest woman he had ever known. He boarded his flight to Germany on a Thursday morning. She was not at the airport. She couldn't afford the transport. She sat instead on the edge of a borrowed mattress in a borrowed room and stared at the wall and pressed her phone against her chest like a heartbeat. He texted her when he landed. "I'm here. I made it. Our time is coming, baby. Watch." She read it and cried, not from sadness, but from relief so overwhelming it felt physical. She had done it. She had gotten him there. Against every odd, against every cost, she had made his dream possible with her bare hands. She had no idea she had just handed a stranger the keys to her own destruction. For the first 3 months, he called. Not always at the times he promised. Germany was busy, he said. The time difference was difficult, he said. He was working double shifts, trying to establish himself, trying to build the foundation he had promised her. She understood. She more than understood. She organized her entire emotional life around understanding him. She worked during the day. She tailored. She took any job available, helping neighbors, doing laundry, braiding hair. She was rebuilding slowly, painfully, sending small amounts back to her cousin for rent, setting aside whatever she could. She did not complain to James about any of this. She didn't want to add weight to the pressure he was already carrying. She waited. 3 months became 5. The calls grew shorter, then less frequent. Then they shifted format, from calls to voice notes, from voice notes to text messages, from text messages to one-word replies that arrived hours after she sent hers. Fine. Busy. Later. She told herself it was the season of building. That men in the process of becoming sometimes go quiet because they are concentrating. She had read that somewhere, or perhaps she had simply invented it as a mercy to herself. By the 8th month, the messages stopped coming first from his end entirely. She was always the one reaching, always the one typing into silence, sending words into a space that returned nothing but a single gray tick delivered but not read, or 2 gray ticks read but not answered. She learned to hate those ticks. She learned what they meant in the language of a love beginning to decompose. She called. The phone rang out. She called again. Same. She sent a long message, careful, warm, not accusatory. She asked if he was okay. She said she was worried. She said she missed him. She said she still believed in them, still held the promise, still waited. No reply. And then one morning she picked up her phone and dialed, and the call connected immediately, not to ringing, but to the flat, automated announcement of a number that had been removed from service. He had changed his number. She sat with that for a very long time. The silence spoke louder than any confrontation could have. It said everything James no longer had the courage to say himself. It said, "You were a chapter and the chapter is finished." It said, "The debt is paid, the favor is used, the dream is launched, and you, Chisom, were only ever the fuel." She pressed her face into her pillow and she did not scream. She had learned by now to carry pain without making sound. Outside, Abia continued its noise, the generators, the traders, the keek engines running their endless routes. The world did not pause. It never does. It started as a whisper. The kind that travels through a neighborhood like smoke. shapeless at first, easy to dismiss, until it fills every room and you can no longer pretend you don't smell it. Chisom heard it from her cousin's neighbor first, then from a woman at the market who paused too long before changing the subject, then from a childhood friend who delivered it with the carefully arranged face of someone who believes they are doing you a kindness by being the one to say it. James was back in Nigeria. Not to visit, not quietly. He was back with money, back with confidence, back with the particular shine of a man who had been abroad and wanted everyone to know it. He was staying in a new duplex on the better side of town, rented, not owned, but the kind of address that made people straighten their posture when they said it. He drove a car that still smelled of newness. He wore clothes that had never touched the inside of an Abia market. And he had brought someone with him. Her name was Ada. She was Nigerian, originally from Enugu, but she had been living in Germany for years before James arrived. She was polished in the specific way that long exposure to Europe polishes people, not arrogant exactly, but settled in herself, at ease in spaces that made others nervous. She was beautiful in a composed, quiet way. She spoke with the faint lilt of someone who moved between languages without effort. They were planning a wedding. Not a small one. A real one, hall booked, caterers engaged, invitations printed on thick card with gold lettering. The whole of their social circle was buzzing. People who had grown up on the same streets as James were already practicing what they would wear. Chisom heard all of this sitting at her sewing machine, a half-finished dress draped over her lap, her hands completely still. She did not cry, not immediately. The news sat inside her chest like something swallowed incorrectly, lodged, immovable, making every breath slightly wrong. She thought about the metal box beneath her father's floorboard. She thought about the borrowed mattress and the borrowed room. She thought about the things she had done in the dark, so he could stand in the light. And then, because she was Chisom, because she was still, after everything, the girl who believed that love required you to see things through to the end, she decided she needed to hear it from him directly. Not for confrontation, not for war, but because she was owed, at the very minimum, a face, a voice, an acknowledgement that she had existed in his life and that her existence had mattered. She went to his duplex on a Tuesday morning. The compound was everything the rumors had promised. A freshly painted gate. A car in the driveway, dark, sleek, the kind with tinted windows and rims that caught the light. Potted plants arranged with careful intention along the entrance path. The smell of new cement and fresh paint still faintly in the air. The smell of a life being assembled from scratch. Chisom stood at the gate for a moment before she knocked. She had dressed carefully that morning, not to impress, but because she understood instinctively that how you arrive at your own reckoning matters. She wore a simple blue dress, clean, well-fitted, one she had made herself. Her hair was neat. Her face was composed. She knocked. A house girl answered and led her to wait in a small sitting room near the entrance. The interior was cool from air conditioning. The furniture was new and matching. A large television on the wall, curtains that reached the floor. She waited. James walked in 6 minutes later. She recognized him immediately and also did not recognize him at all. He had filled out. The thin, hungry sharpness of the young Keek driver was gone, replaced by something broader, more settled. He wore a plain white kaftan and leather slippers. His skin was clear. He looked well-rested in a way she associated with people who had stopped worrying about money. He stopped when he saw her. For a fraction of a second, just one small human fraction, something moved across his face. Something she couldn't name. It was gone before she could hold it. What replaced it was worse than coldness. It was convenience. The face of a man calculating quickly, deciding how to manage an inconvenience with minimum disruption to his schedule. Chisom. He said her name the way you say the name of a place you used to live, with the faint, distracted recognition of someone who has since moved somewhere better. James, she said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced this. I just wanted to talk, that's all. After everything, I think I deserve at least that. She told him she had heard about the wedding. She told him she wasn't there to stop anything. She wasn't there to beg. She only wanted to understand, after 5 years, after everything she had given, after everything she had done that she would carry in her body forever. Did any of it mean anything to him? Did she mean anything? James looked at her for a moment. And then he said the words. Not loudly. Not cruelly in the theatrical sense. He said them with a flatness that was almost businesslike, the tone of a man closing an account he no longer needed. He said she was in his past. He said people grew and moved forward and that clinging to old relationships was a sign of someone who hadn't grown themselves. He said he had a new life now, a real life, and she was not part of it. He said whatever had happened between them was a long time ago and she needed to accept that. And then he said the sentence that would live in her for years. Chisom, honestly, did you think I was going to come back for you? Look at yourself. Look at where you are. Some things were never meant to last. He stood up. He called the house girl to show her out. Chisom rose from the chair. She was shaking, though she held herself so carefully that it was only visible in her hands. A fine, almost invisible tremor, like a string pulled too tight and beginning to fray. She walked to the door. She walked through the gate. She walked down the street. She made it 3 blocks before her legs stopped working properly. She sat down on the concrete edge of a drainage channel on the roadside, in her blue dress in the full afternoon sun, and she pressed her hands over her mouth, and she wept, silently, violently, the kind of weeping that has no sound because the grief is too large for noise. Nobody stopped. The world was busy. It is always busy. The first attempt was with rat poison. She had been back at her cousin's house for 3 weeks after the confrontation. 3 weeks of barely eating, barely sleeping, barely speaking. Her cousin Adiz tried everything, brought her food, sat beside her in the evenings, asked gentle questions that Chisom answered in monosyllables or not at all. The grief had moved past the crying stage into something quieter and far more dangerous. A flatness, a grayness. The feeling of being a building the fire has already moved through, still standing in shape, but hollow inside, nothing left to burn. She stopped responding to her own name when people called it. She sat at the window for hours and watched the street below without seeing any of it. She did not decide to do it in a dramatic moment. That is the thing people do not understand about these moments. They rarely arrive with drama. They arrive in the ordinary gray of a Wednesday night when the generator is off and the room is thick with heat, and you have been staring at the ceiling for hours, and the thought rises very quietly, like a question that has finally lost its patience. What exactly am I staying for? She found the rat poison beneath the kitchen cabinet. The small, familiar sachet that her cousin kept for the occasional rodent problem in the building. She sat on the kitchen floor with it in her hands for a long time. She did not cry. She was beyond crying. She simply felt with a terrible calm that she had given everything she had to offer the world and the world had returned it to her crushed. She mixed it. She drank it. What followed was not peaceful. The body, it turns out, does not surrender quietly. It fights with every mechanism it possesses, violently and without dignity, and Chisom spent the next hour on the bathroom floor in agony that she had not anticipated. Adiz came home to the sound of it, heard her from the front door, ran, found her collapsed against the bathroom wall, her body convulsing, her face gray. She screamed for the neighbors. They got Chisom to the clinic. The doctor worked without ceremony. She survived, not comfortably, not cleanly, but she survived. Her body, despite everything she had put it through, refused to let her go. She came home 3 days later and said nothing about it. Adiz watched her the way you watch a flame near dry cloth, careful, exhausted, terrified. 3 weeks passed. On the surface, Chisom seemed steadier. She ate a little. She responded when spoken to. She even sat at the sewing machine once, though her hands moved without intention, stitching nothing meaningful. Adiz allowed herself to breathe. She should not have, because the steadiness was not recovery. It was decision. There is a particular calm that descends on a person who has made up their mind completely, a quietness that looks, from the outside, like peace, but is actually the absence of conflict because the conflict has been resolved. Chisom had resolved it. She had simply chosen a different method and decided to be more certain this time. She waited until Adiz left for the market on a Saturday morning. She took the ceiling fan hook in the bedroom, old and iron, fixed into the concrete ceiling with the permanence of things built in another era. She used the long wrapper she had owned since secondary school, the one her mother had bought her, deep burgundy with gold threading along the edges, the one she had worn on the day James first told her he loved her under the mango tree. She stood on the plastic chair. She had knotted it carefully. She was always precise with her hands. She was stepping off the chair when Adiz walked back through the front door. She had forgotten her purse. She had turned back at the junction, irritated with herself, and walked quickly back to the flat and pushed open the bedroom door and saw her cousin. What came out of Adiz in that moment was not a scream. It was something beneath screaming, a sound that had no name, a sound that the body produces when the mind cannot process what the eyes are delivering. She moved faster than she had ever moved in her life. She got Chisom down. She held her on the floor, both of them shaking, Chisom barely conscious, the wrapper still around her neck, Adiz's arms locked around her from behind, both of them on the cold concrete floor of that small bedroom in Abia. "No," Adiz said into her hair, rocking her, her voice completely broken. "No, you are not going, not like this, not for him. No." She said it over and over, like a prayer, like a command, like both. The neighbors came again. The hospital again. But this time someone called her parents. Her mother arrived first. She had taken the first available transport from Abia, did not wait to pack properly, did not stop to explain herself to anyone, simply moved the moment the call reached her with the absolute, wordless priority of a woman who understood that nothing else in the world mattered until she reached her child. She walked into that hospital ward and she saw Chisom, small against the white sheets, the marks on her neck still visible, her face turned toward the window, and something in her mother's chest opened completely. Not broke. Opened. Like a door that had been locked for too long suddenly giving way. She sat beside the bed. She took Chisom's hand in both of hers and she held it the way you hold something you almost lost, tightly, consciously, with the full awareness of how close the distance between having and not having really is. She did not speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was wrecked but her words were clear. "Everything I said, everything that happened with the money, all of it. None of it matters, you hear me? None of it matters next to this. You are my child. You were always my child. And you are not allowed to leave me." She pressed her forehead against Chisom's hand and she wept. Her father came the following morning. He stood in the doorway of the ward for a very long time. He was older than she remembered. The months of estrangement had pressed new lines into his face, rounded his shoulders with a weight that had nothing to do with age. He looked at the marks on his daughter's neck, and something moved through his face that was too large and too private to observe directly. He crossed the room. He sat in the chair beside her bed. He said nothing. He reached out and placed his large, rough-palmed hand, the hands that had repaired motorcycles her entire childhood, the hands that knew how to fix broken things over both of hers, and he kept it there. That was all. He didn't revisit the money. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't speak at all for a very long time. He simply sat beside his daughter and held her hands and let the silence say what words in any language were not equipped to carry. Chisom looked at her father's hands over hers, at the familiar cracks in his knuckles, at the old scar along his thumb from a blade that had slipped years ago, at the hands she had known her entire life, that had been withheld from her for months, that were now back, completely, without condition. Shame is like a hand closing around the throat. But a father's return, when it comes without terms, without the requirement that you earn it back, can be the thing that loosens the grip entirely. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept without dreaming. The decision to send her to Lagos was made quietly and practically, the way families make decisions when they are trying to save someone without making the saving feel like punishment. Her mother's younger sister, Auntie Ngozi, lived in Surulere, a small but decent flat, a woman who worked in textiles, no nonsense and warm in the gruff way of people who have had difficult lives and come out the other side with their humor intact. She agreed without hesitation. "Send her. I'll take care of her." Chisom arrived in Lagos with one bag and a face that was still learning to feel things again, tentatively, like a foot testing ice. The city received her the way Lagos receives everyone, without ceremony, without gentleness, without any particular interest in her history. It simply continued moving and invited her to move with it or be left behind. She chose to move. Auntie Ngozi enrolled her in a fashion design training program within a month of her arrival. Not as therapy, Ngozi would have been insulted by the framing. As strategy. As the most sensible next step for a young woman with nimble hands, an eye for detail, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Chisom threw herself into it with the focused fury of a woman who had decided that if she was going to survive, she was going to do it so completely that survival became unrecognizable from triumph. She stayed late after classes. She practiced patterns at the kitchen table after dinner. She made mistakes and unmade them and made them again until her hands knew what her mind was still learning. She did not think about James. Or rather, she did, constantly, and then she sewed another seam. Cut another pattern, adjusted another hem. She traded his memory inch by inch for skill. By her 8th month in Lagos, she was taking private clients. Small jobs first, a birthday dress, alterations, a simple 2-piece for a woman who had seen her work and asked around. She charged fairly. She delivered perfectly. She put her whole self into every piece, not because the jobs were glamorous, but because she had learned, at a cost she would never fully recover from, that the only things that truly belonged to you were the things you built yourself. Her reputation grew the way real reputations grow. Slowly, without announcement, carried person to person by the satisfied. And then came the client who opened the door to everything. Her name was Mrs. Ajora Nwasu, wife of a senior executive, a woman who attended functions where the wrong outfit was remembered for years. She had been referred to Chisom through a chain of connection, the right name reaching the right ear at exactly the right moment. The way Lagos arranges these things when it decides to be kind to you. She came to Auntie Ngozi's flat on a Saturday morning. She was composed, unhurried, the kind of woman who had long stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. She wanted a gown for the businesswomen's annual gala. She had a feeling rather than a reference image, something that commanded without demanding, elegant without apology. Chisom listened to every word. She asked 3 questions. She sketched while they spoke, quick, confident lines that made Mrs. Nwasu lean forward slightly in her chair. She delivered the gown 11 days later. It was extraordinary in the way that extraordinary things announce themselves, quietly first, then completely. The fabric moved correctly. The structure held the body without confining it. The color, a deep, considered burgundy, caught the light at every angle with the intelligence of something that had been thought about, not just chosen. Mrs. Nwasu stood before the mirror for a long time without speaking. Then she turned and said, "How much do I owe you?" She paid without negotiating. Then she added more. "Consider this a retainer," she said. "You'll be hearing from me." She wore the gown to the gala. 3 women asked for Chisom's number before the evening was over. Chisom stood in Auntie Ngozi's small kitchen that night, holding her phone, eyes bright with something she hadn't felt in so long she had almost forgotten its name. Hope. Real, earned, unborrowable hope. The wrapper she had used on that Saturday morning in Abia, the burgundy one with the gold threading, the one from James's mango tree. She had left it behind when she packed for Lagos. She had not taken it with her. She had left it in that room. In that past, she was not that girl anymore. The storm had passed. The ground was ravaged and reshaped, but she was standing on it, upright, breathing, building, and the sun, slow and certain, was finally rising. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday. No music swelled. No light shifted dramatically through the windows. The universe did not arrange itself into anything cinematic or convenient. It happened the way the best things in life tend to happen, without permission, without preparation, in the middle of something entirely mundane. Chisom was in a supermarket in Lekki. She had driven herself there after a client fitting, one of 6 that week, her schedule now fuller than she had ever imagined possible 18 months ago. She was tired in the good way, the way that comes from work that means something, from days that end with a feeling of having genuinely built rather than simply survived. She had a list. She was focused. Her mind was already half on the beating detail of a bridal corset she was finishing the following morning. She reached for a bottle of olive oil on the top shelf at the exact same moment another hand reached for it from the opposite direction. Their fingers touched the bottle simultaneously. She looked up. He was tall, not dramatically so, but with the kind of height that suggested it had never occurred to him to make himself smaller for anyone's comfort. He wore a plain gray shirt, simple dark trousers, a watch that was good quality without announcing itself loudly to the room. His face was open and unhurried, the face of a man who moved through the world without urgency because he had nothing to prove to it and nowhere more important to be. He looked at the bottle, then at her, and smiled, not a rehearsed smile, not the practiced, calibrated smile of a man who had been told he was charming and had learned to deploy it strategically. Just a genuine, slightly amused acknowledgement of the small comedy of the situation. 2 people, 1 bottle, a shelf that had already decided the outcome. "Sorry," he said simply. "Please take it." "It's fine, I'll find another one," she said. "There isn't one, that's the last bottle." They both looked at the empty shelf, then back at each other. "Then take it," they both said at exactly the same moment. And then they both laughed, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded and completely unplanned, the kind that dissolves awkwardness so thoroughly it leaves warmth in its place. The kind of laugh that two strangers share and then look at each other slightly differently afterwards, both quietly aware that something small but real just happened between them. His name was Ugachukwu, Ugona to everyone who knew him. He was from Anambra, based in Lagos for over a decade, and he had a way of listening, fully, completely, with his whole attention, without the restlessness of a man merely waiting for his turn to speak. That Chisom noticed immediately and quietly filed away somewhere important inside herself. They stood in that aisle for nearly 25 minutes. He asked questions that were genuinely curious, about her work, about fashion design, about what it felt like to make something from nothing with your hands, and then watch a person walk into a room wearing it. He listened to her answers the way you listen to a song you are hearing for the first time and already know you will want to hear again. He asked for her number before they parted, not with performance or pressure. Simply, directly, as a man who knew what he wanted and trusted the other person to decide for themselves without needing to be maneuvered into it. She gave it to him. She walked to her car afterwards and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. She stared through the windshield at the evening traffic thickening outside, and she did a quiet, honest inventory of what she was feeling. She was not giddy. She was not swept away. She was careful, interested but careful. Like a person who has been badly burned, standing near a fire again for the first time, drawn to the warmth because warmth is human and necessary and good, but deeply, bodily aware now of what fire can do when you stop paying attention to it. She started the engine. She did not tell herself it was anything yet. She simply left a door slightly open inside herself and waited to see what the light did. Ugona called the next day, not to impress her with elaborate plans, not to perform availability or urgency. He called simply to continue the conversation, asked what she was working on, listened to her talk about the beading detail on the bridal corset, asked a follow-up question that demonstrated he had actually heard her and not simply waited politely for her to finish. It was such a small thing, such a devastatingly simple thing. And yet Chisom, who had spent 5 years loving a man who heard her words without ever truly listening to them, who had absorbed the sound of her voice without absorbing what it carried, felt the difference the way you feel the difference between standing in shade and standing in sunlight. Not dramatic. Unmistakable. They met for lunch the following weekend. He chose a quiet restaurant, not the most expensive in Lagos, not a performance of wealth designed to impress her into something, just somewhere with genuinely good food and enough quiet to actually talk. He arrived before her. When she walked in, he stood up from the table. She noticed that. She filed it away. She learned things about him slowly, the way you learn the layout of a house you have been invited to explore at your own pace, with the lights left on and no one rushing you. He owned property, several duplexes in Lagos and in Awka. He had a gas station in Lekki, a fast food business in its second year of operation, a construction company that was growing with the measured steadiness of something built on a realistic plan rather than wishful thinking. He mentioned these things not as credentials displayed for her approval, not as a list assembled to impress, but the way you mention furniture when someone asks where you live matter-of-factly, because it is simply the reality of your situation. What she noticed far more than the businesses was how he spoke about the people inside them, by name, with specificity. The site manager at his construction company whose wife had just delivered twins and who he had given 2 weeks off without being asked. The young woman at the fast food counter who was saving quietly to go back to university and who he had started paying a slightly higher salary to make the timeline shorter. He tracked these things. They were not performances of generosity designed for an audience. She could tell the difference now. They were simply the way he moved through the world. He paid attention to people because he genuinely believed they were worth paying attention to. He was quietly, completely, without theater or announcement, good. She did not rush toward him. She had learned, at a cost she would carry in her body for the rest of her life, what rushing toward a man before you truly knew him felt like. She moved slowly, deliberately. She checked herself at every stage, not him, but herself. She was looking for the difference between genuine feeling and the old familiar hunger, dressed in new clothing. The difference between love and the performance of love. The difference between a man who was consistent because he was genuinely that person and a man who was consistent only because the conditions were still favorable. Month after month, Ugona was the same warmth in the third month as in the first. Same attentiveness when she was tired and uncommunicative as when she was bright and easy to be with. He did not require her to be impressive for him to be interested. He did not require her to diminish herself for him to feel large. He simply showed up. Reliably, quietly, completely. After 4 months, he asked her formally to be his girlfriend. Directly, respectfully, with no pressure in the question, just a man nomming what he hoped for and trusting her to answer honestly. She said yes. After 9 months of building something together, slowly, with intention, with the care of two people who both understood by now that love was not a feeling that arrived fully formed, but a structure you raised together, carefully, one true thing at a time, he asked her to marry him. He did not do it publicly. Not because he was ashamed of her. She knew that completely, in the particular way you know things that have been demonstrated rather than simply stated. He did it privately because he understood, without needing to be told, that Chisom was not a woman who needed her most sacred moments turned into performances for other people's consumption. He had paid attention to her long enough to know what she needed. He did it at sunset on the balcony of her flat. No elaborate setup. No audience. Just the two of them, and the city going golden in the distance, and a ring he had chosen by going to 3 different jewelers and asking each of them the same question. Which one is made to last? He had chosen the one all 3 agreed on without hesitation. She looked at the ring. She looked at him, at his face, at the steadiness in his eyes, at the man who had never once made her feel like she was too much or not enough or anything other than exactly what she was. And she thought, briefly and completely honestly, about everything it had cost her to arrive at this exact moment. Every sacrifice, every dark night. The rat poison on the kitchen floor, the wrapper around the ceiling hook, her father's metal box. The things she had done so James could fly while she stayed earthbound and invisible, she thought. All of it brought me here, not James, not the pain, not the betrayal. Her own survival brought her here. Her own stubborn, undefeated, unreasonable refusal to stay gone. Yes, she said. He placed the ring on her finger. He held her hand. He pulled her close and held her not tightly, not possessively, but with the steady, conscious warmth of a man who intended to keep what he had been given and understood the weight and the privilege of the responsibility. She pressed her face against his chest and closed her eyes. Outside, Lagos continued its relentless noise. The generators. The traffic. The city that had received her broken and watched her rebuild herself piece by careful piece. She did not cry. She had cried enough for 3 lifetimes. She simply breathed deep and slow and full, and felt something she had not felt in so long it had almost become theoretical. Safe. They planned it for 8 months, not because Chisom needed 8 months to arrange flowers and negotiate menus, but because Ugona said, quietly, firmly, without negotiation, that his wife's wedding would be done with the fullness it deserved. And fullness, real fullness, took the time it took. He refused to rush something that was meant to be remembered. He involved her in every decision without requiring her to carry the weight of any of them alone. He had strong opinions, and he offered them clearly, and then he deferred to hers on the things that mattered most to her, the flowers, the color palette, the order of events, because he understood the difference between having taste and needing control. They disagreed twice during the planning. Both times they talked it through without raising their voices. Both times they found something better than either of them had originally proposed. Her parents were there. Her mother, who had held her hand in a hospital ward and said, "You are not allowed to leave me." She was in the front row in a deep wine-colored wrapper that Chisom had quietly made for her as a surprise, delivered 2 weeks before the wedding without explanation. Her mother had unwrapped it and pressed it against her chest and not been able to speak for several minutes. Her father was there. The man who had once turned his back and closed his bedroom door and moved around her like she was air. He was there in his best agbada, sitting upright beside his wife, and when Chisom appeared in the doorway of the reception hall in her gown, he rose from his chair before anyone else did. Just stood, looking at his daughter. His jaw working with the effort of containing something too large for a room. She saw him stand. She held his gaze across the distance of that hall, and she gave him the smallest nod. The kind that said everything important between two people who had been through something together, and come out the other side still standing, still chosen. He sat back down and pressed his hand briefly over his eyes. Auntie Ngozi was in the second row, hands clasped in her lap, chin lifted in the particular posture of a woman who has earned every right to be proud and intends to exercise it fully. She did not weep. She was not a woman who wept publicly. She simply sat with her back perfectly straight and watched her niece, the girl she had received broken and watched rebuild from the ground up, walk into her future, and she allowed herself, privately and completely, to be satisfied. Mrs. Ajora Nwasu was there, the first client who had opened the door, wearing deep emerald that evening, one of Chisom's designs naturally, because she had worn nothing else to any important occasion in the past year, and told everyone who asked exactly where it came from. The venue was full. Not just with numbers, with genuine presence. People who had chosen to be there because they loved someone in that room, not because attendance was obligatory. The ceremony was beautiful in the way that real things are beautiful, not because everything went perfectly. The flower arrangement on the left side arrived wrong and had to be hastily adjusted. The sound system crackled for 90 seconds during the opening prayer. Chisom's youngest sibling spilled Sabalo on his shirt during the cocktail hour. But none of it mattered because what was happening was true. And truth, in a room full of people who can feel the difference, produces something that manufactured perfection never can. But outside the gates, as the celebration reached its fullest warmth, something else was also moving toward them. Germany had not kept its promise to James either. The years had given him what ambition without discipline always eventually produces. Early abundance followed by a collapse, so complete it left no foundation to rebuild on. The business partnerships had unraveled. An investment that should have been examined more carefully turned out to be less legitimate than it had been presented, and by the time the full picture emerged, it had consumed resources James had not prepared to lose. Properties surrendered. Accounts that drained faster than he could refill them, no matter how urgently he rearranged what remained. Ada watched the deterioration with the calm, patient inventory of a woman who had agreed to love a particular version of James, the confident, ascending version, and was now in the uncomfortable position of watching that version disassemble itself in real time. She stayed through the first year of financial difficulty. She stayed through the second, though a quietness had entered her that James recognized and was afraid to name directly. In the third year, she sat across from him at their kitchen table one morning and told him she was leaving in the same measured tone she might have used to announce any practical decision she had arrived at after sufficient thought. She had already seen a lawyer. She had already filed. She was not theatrical about it. She was simply, completely finished. She left. James sat in an apartment that was no longer in his name and understood, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, what it felt like to be left by someone who had genuinely reorganized their future around his absence. Not with drama, not with a confrontation that at least credited him with being worth the energy. Just gone. The debts followed him everywhere he tried to go. There were people who required repayment on timelines that were not flexible. Legal complications from the failed partnership circled him like a tightening rope. His visa situation became complicated, then precarious, then resolved in the most brutal direction available. He was deported on a gray November morning. He landed in Lagos with one bag, and the face of a man that a country has finished with, older than his years, emptied of the particular shine that going abroad had once filled him with, stripped of every external thing he had used to define himself since he was 22 years old. He went back to Abia. His family received him with the complicated love of people who had not stopped caring despite having watched him from a distance making choices they could not intercept. He slept in his mother's house. He ate at his mother's table. He wore the same clothes again in rotation and did not talk about Germany unless someone directly asked, and even then he gave only the briefest outline. And he thought about Chisom, not the way he had once dismissed her, not as the inconvenient remnant of a chapter he had already closed. He thought about her the way you think about something irreplaceable after you have already broken it beyond repair and know it, with a specific, unrelenting clarity that arrives only when everything that once obscured it has been stripped completely away. He remembered the night of the fever. Her hands on his forehead in the dark, cool and steady. Her voice bringing him back from the worst of it. The way she had stayed through hours of it without complaint, without making him feel like a burden, without requiring anything from him in return except that he get better. He remembered the money. He understood it now, fully, without the comfortable distance of a man still ascending who could afford not to look directly at what something had cost another person. He understood what the metal box had meant, what the borrowed money had meant, what the darkest of her sacrifices had meant, the things she had done to her own body, her own dignity, her own sense of herself, so that he could board a flight and start a life on the other side of the world. He had received all of it. He had used all of it. He had looked back once and seen her still standing there, and felt, in that moment, only relief that she was stationary while he was moving. He understood now what he had held in his hands and released without ever once examining its weight. He went to her parents' house. Her father answered the door. He stood in the frame and looked at James, at the diminished, weathered version of the young man who had once taken everything his daughter had to offer and called it love, and his expression held none of the anger James had prepared himself for. It was quieter and more final than anger. It was the face of a man who had already processed his feelings about this person a long time ago and arrived at a place of complete indifference. "I want to see her," James said. "I just need to know she's okay, please." Her father regarded him for a moment. "She is more than okay," he said. His voice was even, undisturbed. "She is everything. She is happy and she is loved and she is well, and she did not get there with any help from you. Please, go home, James." Door closed, not with force, not with the dramatic slam of a man making a point. Simply closed, final. With the absolute, unhurried certainty of a door that will not be opening again, James stood on that step for a long time. Then he walked away. He heard about the wedding from a man at the motor park, someone who knew someone who had been invited, who mentioned it casually in the listless conversation of the idol. He heard Chisom's name and the word wedding arrive in the same sentence, and something in him, the last stubborn remnant of the ego that had once looked at her across a sitting room and told her she was not worth coming back for, rose up with immediate, irrational, ugly disbelief. He told himself it wasn't serious. He told himself men like that didn't marry women like her, not the Chisom he had known, not the girl from the struggling family, not the girl he had thrown out of his gate. He told himself she was performing a life she hadn't really built. He told himself, with the particular desperation of a man whose own life has collapsed entirely, that she could not possibly have moved forward completely. That somewhere inside her, she was still waiting. Still his. He borrowed a clean shirt. He found transport to Lagos. He arrived at the venue in the full heat of the reception, the music pulsing warmly through the walls, golden light visible through the windows, the sound of people who were genuinely celebrating reaching him at the gate like a language from another world. He pushed through the entrance. He stopped. Chisom was in the center of the room. She was wearing a gown of ivory silk with hand-stitched gold detailing that caught the light at every movement. A gown she had made herself, with the hands that had once made her small by night so he could grow tall by day. She was standing beside a man who was taller than James, broader than James, steadier in his bearing than James had ever been, even at his most confident. The man had leaned down to say something close to her ear, and she was laughing, not performing laughter, not the social laugh of a woman at a public event, but the real thing, the unguarded thing, the laugh that lives in the body and arrives without warning. She looked like someone who had been through fire and chosen. On the other side, warmth instead of ash. She looked like a woman who had found the exact life she deserved. She looked free. James took 3 steps into the room. He was seen immediately, not by Chisom, not by Ugona, but by the men positioned quietly near the entrance whose entire purpose was to ensure that the evening remained exactly what it was designed to be. They reached him before he could reach the center of the floor. They asked him, quietly and with professional firmness, to leave. He said her name instead, loudly. The way a man calls out to something he still believes belongs to him despite every evidence to the contrary. He said it like an announcement. Like a claim, the room shifted. Heads turned. Chisom turned. She saw him. And the expression on her face, this was the moment that would stay with James Ez for the rest of his life, that would come to him in the small hours of mornings for years, that would sit beside him in every quiet room he ever occupied alone. The expression on her face was not what he had hoped for, and not what he had feared. It was not anger. It was not the wounded, devastated recognition of a woman reliving old pain at the sight of the man who caused it. It was not shock. It was not even surprise, really. It was calm. The deep, earned, unperformable calm of a woman looking at something that no longer has the power to reach her. The calm of someone who recognizes an old chapter and feels, in that recognition, only gratitude that it is over. She looked at him the way you look at a scar that healed long ago. You see it. You remember what made it. You register it briefly and completely. And then you return to whatever you were doing before you looked down. She turned back to her husband. She said something to him, quietly, just for the two of them, and he looked once in James's direction with the measured, unbothered glance of a man who has absolutely nothing to feel threatened by and knows it, and then he returned his full attention to his wife. James was removed, efficiently, thoroughly, without malice. The men walked him backward through the entrance, through the gate and out onto the pavement, and the door closed behind him with a sound that was not loud but was the most final sound he had ever heard. He stood outside, alone, on the pavement, in a borrowed shirt, in a city that did not know his name. The music from inside continued, muffled now by the walls but insistent, alive, warm. The sound of an entire room of people celebrating a woman's happiness. A woman he had held in his hands and thrown away because he had mistaken her patience for smallness and her love for weakness and her loyalty for something he was owed rather than something he had been given. He had nothing. No money to get home comfortably. No wife. No business. No country that wanted him. No property, no car, no future with any clear shape. He had the clothes he was wearing, and the full, crushing weight of his own choices pressing down on him on a pavement outside the wedding of the woman he had destroyed, and who had, despite everything he had done, rebuilt herself into something magnificent without him. He sat down on the pavement, and he wept. Ugly, graceless, completely unwitnessed weeping, the kind with no audience and no comfort and no resolution. The kind that is simply the sound a life makes when it finally and fully understands, far too late to do anything about it, exactly what it had in its hands, and exactly how completely it has thrown it away. Nobody came out to find him. Nobody knew he was there. The celebration continued inside, warm and full and alive, holding no space for his grief because his grief was his own to carry. The only thing, in the end, that truly and completely belonged to him. Inside, the music changed. Something slower. Something that moved through the room like a held breath finally released. Ugona led Chisom to the center of the floor. He held her the way a man holds something he understands the full value of, not tightly, not with the grip of possession, but with the steady, conscious, wide-awake care of someone who has chosen deliberately and intends to keep choosing. His hand at her back was warm and sure. She rested her head briefly against his shoulder and felt the solid reality of him, his heartbeat, his breathing, his complete and unhurried presence, and something inside her that had been quietly braced for years, some deep interior tension she had carried so long she had stopped noticing it, released. She thought about her mother in the front row, who had sat beside a hospital bed and refused to leave. She thought about her father, who had crossed a room and placed his broken-engine hands over hers without saying a word, because some things are beyond what words can carry. She thought about Auntie Ngozi in her second-row seat with her spine perfectly straight and her chin lifted and her hands folded in her lap. Watching everything with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who planted something in difficult soil and is now watching it bloom. She thought about the girl who had lain on a bathroom floor in a bath, and the girl who had stood on a chair with a wrapper around a ceiling hook, and the girl who had made herself invisible for years so someone else could be seen. She thought, you had no idea what was coming. And you came anyway, not with triumph, not with bitterness. With something far larger and more generous than either, with the profound, quiet wonder of a person standing on the other side of their own survival, looking back at the full distance traveled and feeling, not pride exactly, but awe. Awe at the distance. Awe at what the human heart can endure and still choose, eventually, to open. She had not arrived here because James had been punished. She had not arrived here because the universe had decided to even the score or because suffering had been fairly distributed or because love, in the end, always rewards the loyal. She had arrived here because she had survived. Because people who loved her had reached into the dark and refused to let go. because she had taken the rubble of what had been done to her, and with her own hands, built something from it, one seam, one pattern, one client, one careful step at a time. The sacrifice she had made had not been wasted. It had been misdirected, spent on a man who had never been built to hold it. But the capacity for that sacrifice, the depth of devotion, the willingness to love without reservation, the ability to give completely, that had always been hers. It still was. And now it belonged to someone who deserved it. She lifted her head and looked at her husband, at his face in the soft, warm light of the room, at the way he was looking back at her like she was both the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing in his world, like her presence beside him was a fact he was grateful for every single day and intended to remain grateful for, and she smiled, full, unhurried, unperformed, completely, irrevocably her own. Outside, a man she used to love was sitting on a pavement in the dark, holding the hollow victory of every choice he had ever made. Inside, a woman he had completely underestimated was dancing. The storm was long over. The air was clean and wide and full of light. And Chisom, who had come from a struggling household on a dusty street in Abia, who had given until she had nothing left to give, who had broken in the most complete and terrible ways a person can break, who had been rebuilt not by anyone else's hands, but by the stubborn and extraordinary persistence of her own will to continue, was finally, completely, irrevocably home. Not because she had won, because she had survived. And survival, when you have come as close to the edge as she had, is the most extraordinary victory there is. Do not pour your ocean into a cup that was never designed to hold it. Your depth was never the problem. Your direction was. And when you finally find the one who is built for the size of your love, the one who does not require you to be smaller to make them feel larger, you will understand that everything you survived was not punishment. It was preparation. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own strength, or the strength of someone you love who deserved better and found it anyway, give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Every story we tell on this channel is a reminder that the end of one chapter is never the end of the book. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. See you in the next one.